Good evening. This is Face the Nation. International Women's Day 2023 is marked the world over today. How must we move beyond the tokenism and truly enable more inclusive spaces, structures for women to feel included, empowered, and unencumbered? The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned that gender equality is vanishing before our eyes, and it is now 300 years away. He said many of the world's nations are regressing on reproductive rights, forced early marriages, being deprived of education. He called for urgent action and said that centuries of patriarchy, discrimination, and harmful stereotypes have created a huge gender gap in science and technology. Tonight's discussion is on overcoming barriers. I'm so pleased to welcome to our studios here at Stein Ratmalana three incredible guests. We're joined by Professor Pianjali de Souza, Senior Professor and Clinical Psychologist. Good evening and welcome to you.
Thank you, Sonali.
Professor Hemamali Gunathilaka, attached to the Department of Business Administration, University of Sri Jayewardenepura, also the Acting Director of the Centre for Gender at the University Grants Commission. Good evening and welcome. And joining us for the first time on our show, Amita Arudpragasam, Independent Policy Analyst. Good evening and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
My first question I'd like to pose to Professor Hemamali. Professor Hemamali, let's talk a bit on gender equity, going beyond equality to that of equity. How gender equity needs to be a part of every conversation, because equal opportunities alone are not enough as people start from different places. Equity-based solutions take into account the diverse lived experiences of people. So, as a precursor to this conversation, if you could, in 3 minutes, outline the importance of gender equity.
Yeah, thank you for that very interesting question. When it comes to equity and equality, first if we talk about equality, equality means treating everyone the same. You treat everyone in the same manner, right? But as you pointed out very correctly, we are in a world where we have people with different nature, that is, people with different needs, right? So when it comes to, let's say, it may be children, it may be men, it may be women from different ethnicities, different, let's say, religions, with different abilities, I would highlight. So when we take this diverse set of people, when you start treating them equally, sometimes there may be instances where this equal treatment is not sufficient to fulfill the different needs these diverse people are having. Let's say, for example, in an organization, you employ people who are unable to walk, so they use their wheelchairs. So if you employ people with wheelchairs, you have to have the facility for the people to come into organization, do their work without any discrimination, without hindering the capacity to perform at their best, to utilize their potential. Organization or society or wherever you are, you must not get limitations because of your difference. So if we pay attention to that, ensuring that people with differences are treated in the way they are being facilitated to use their full potential. So that is equity. So equality is treating the same to everyone, but we must understand that there are people with different needs. So when we pay attention to different needs and cater to their needs, we are assuring that there's equity.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that introduction. My second question is to Professor Pianjali de Souza, Senior Professor and Clinical Psychologist. Professor, I thought of getting your feedback today on a an area that we haven't usually sort of had a conversation on. Let's speak about mental well-being vis-a-vis relationships, romantic relationships. The woman has to be aware of her rights, her responsibilities, but there are now all of these new phrases that are coming into the fore, such as gaslighting, ghosting, love bombing, breadcrumbing. Speak to us about emotional violence, how that can be used against women, and how women need to be aware of psychologically being gaslighted.
Yes. So Sonali, like a lot of us now are quite familiar with physical violence,
Right.
you know, which you call domestic violence also. But what we don't really think about much and know about is psychological violence. Because psychological violence is so insidious, you know, you can't touch it. Physical violence, you can see the scar and the, you know, shot on the face and the blue eyes and everything and the strangle marks. Psychological violence is where the attack is on the person's mind, to destroy the person's mind. So it can happen from man to woman or woman to man, of course. But research have shown that it's mostly man to woman, but there are exceptions. So when we call about psychological violence, it's where, say in the context of a man as the perpetrator, attacks a woman's mind in various ways. So for example, these terms that you said, love bombing is where at the onset of a relationship or before even a relationship has started, this the suitor might be really texting you, calling you, sending you gifts and bombing you with love, which can be a little uncomfortable. Now we see that in traditional societies, and women who are not that empowered kind of like it. They
Right.
think, he really likes me. You
Because
know?
you get the
Oh,
validation.
yes, 100 text messages and whatnot. And very, very thrilled about it. Then the woman, even if she may not initially like the man, might then agree. There are a lot of bombing of love now. Then once the woman has now got into a relationship, then starts another scenario, which we can call as breadcrumbing. Now breadcrumbing comes from, we feed birds crumbs. We don't give them the entire piece of size of bread. We give them a crumb. So similarly, a man can give, now the initial love bombing stops. Now it's a little bit of a love, one text messages. Or when the woman sends a text message, the response comes about 5 hours after, or with one word response. So now the crumbs have started. Then another phenomena is gaslighting. Now that's very dangerous. Gaslighting actually comes from a movie in the 1930s called The Gaslighter.
Okay.
Where a man changes the reality of the woman. So he would say things like, say if he pushed her and she says, why did you push me? And he would say, I didn't push you, we just fell. Or the woman, they would go for a party and the woman is eating something and she would say, that's a really tasty meal. Did you eat it? So you're basically toying with the woman's reality. And that's really dangerous because after some time, the woman thinks she's going crazy. That she doesn't believe her own thoughts, her feelings and her own reality. And that makes her very dependent on the man. Now we have come across situations, Sonali, where sometimes the woman might find even underwear of other women in the husband's clothes or in the car, and the husband says, oh, it's your underwear. And she says, well, I don't wear this size. But he would say, but it's yours. And the woman thinks, okay, it may be mine. So that's a level of gaslighting. So all of these tactics are called psychological violence. There are so many others. It can erode a woman's self-confidence and mental well-being. But we don't know much about it, but so many women undergo this.
All right. Thank you for this introduction. I think it's a really, really important topic that we need to delve into more. Let's also talk about trauma, childhood trauma, which can result in adults behaving the way they do. Thank you for that, Professor Pianjali. My third question in the first round to Amita Arudpragasam, Independent Policy Analyst. Amita, let's talk a bit about women in politics, how politics is such a dirty word. You can't get into parliament because you have to fear for your safety, your integrity, getting character assassinated. Why is it so harmful for a woman to be in politics when women make up 52% of the population, when women are the majority of graduates, etc.? The statistics are out there, but why is it in 2023 that we're still having this conversation of abysmal women's representation in parliament, in local government, in other organizations, at the helm, in director boards, court structures at the superior courts? Why?
Well, there are many reasons for, I think, the lack of women representation in politics, in local government, provincial councils, parliament. But I'd like to draw on something that we talked about at the individual and psychological level, or draw off that. We talked about gaslighting a little bit, and I think during the Aragalia we've also seen ways in which we can be collectively gaslit.
Right.
That's a way that when we talk about gender inequality, we are sometimes gaslighting ourselves when we talk about the state of women in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
I've heard so many times people talking about how Sri Lanka has had the first head of state, and use that as an example to show that women are actually well represented in politics in this country. That's not the case. That's actually perhaps an example of how how women are being collectively gaslit in this country. If you look at the reality, we have only about 12 out of 225 parliamentarians who are women. That number is 0 for Tamils and Muslims. We have, I think, about 5% of women in provincial councils. And even though we've made some progress in terms of creating quotas in provincial councils and in local government, we haven't done enough. And again, to address your original question, there's a lot that we have to do within our media institutions in terms of combating bias and how we look and frame gender issues and talk about women. And there's a lot we have to do in terms of combating bias and discrimination within parties, within institutions like the police. It is difficult for women to enter politics compared to men to begin with, because they start from a position where they're expected to take care of children, even though they may be as qualified as men to take part in politics and to take part in the workforce. So they already start with a duty of care that men don't necessarily have. And then they enter, they face discrimination at all these different levels, from the media, from within political parties, from the public as well. We see very hateful speech being levied against women who dare to show their face in politics, or dare to speak about or provide their opinion on politics even. And so it's no surprise to me that so few women actually want to participate in politics. The costs are just so high, and that consequently we have so few women in politics in Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much. It's a bleak picture, but let's try to also collectively come up with solutions during the course of the next 1 hour 15 minutes. I'd like to introduce a panel of journalists who will join me in questioning our 3 guests. We're joined by Ruhaza Irfan. Good evening, Ruhaza. And also Mariam Gunavijaya. Hi, Mariam.
Good evening, Sonali.
Why don't you start the questioning?
Sure. I'd like to pose my first question to Professor Hemamali. I'll start off by focusing on the university system in Sri Lanka. Despite there being high number of female students in Sri Lanka's university system, it's very unlikely that we see a lot of female student leaders, like union leaders and stuff. Like even when we take the Aragalaya, the IUSF and all, it's a lot of male students that we see. Why is it that we see less female student leaders? Isn't the UGC doing enough to facilitate their needs? What is the reason behind this?
Yeah. Amita talked about the representation of women in the parliament. So that is leadership, right? Women in leadership roles. In the Sri Lankan context, we are into a patriarchal social structure. So within a patriarchal social structure is the rule of the father that governs, right, in households. And also when you look at the leadership roles, if you take an organization, if you look at the top positions are governed mainly by men, right? If you look at the corporate boards, the composition of the corporate boards, you will find more men, very few women, or no women at all, right? So when it comes to leadership, in the Sri Lankan context, it is the belief that men should lead, right? This is my opinion in this regard by being in the university system for 30 long years. This, like, when it comes to the student associations, not the unions I'm talking, each of these academic departments, we do have student associations where they organize certain academic and social activities. Whenever you have an election to elect a president for a student societies, right? Not the unions, right? I'm highlighting it. So there, they always elect. In our faculty, it's like 60% girls and 40% boys. But when it comes to electing a president, it's a boy that is getting elected. And when it comes to secretary, it's a girl, right? All the time, that's it. So this comes from the society as well. If you look into the broader society, when you have some form of a, let's say, a club, a society, whatever, president is a man, secretary is a woman, right? This I will explain as the social construction of gender. Gender is a social construct. We'll talk about it in even more detail later on. So the society expects women to do certain roles and men to do certain roles. So leadership roles, society expects men to play. And it is the belief that men are better leaders than women. Another reason which I want to highlight as one of my opinions, being in a patriarchal social structure, it's the rule of the father, as I told you all. So for men to be under a woman leader, who are we to be under a woman leader, right? We are the governors, we are the rulers, right? So why are we to be under a woman? Why can't we become a leader? So this attitude, I would say, prevents women getting into to leadership positions. Even the top level positions in the university administration. Look at the composition of vice chancellors. Out of 17 universities, you'll find, I think, 3 women vice chancellors out of 17. Is that an equal representation?
Exactly.
No, right? So in my opinion, it's the broader society's attitude that is coming in and reproducing within the universities as well.
But what can we do to change that?
It is like you can't do it overnight. It takes time. Changing an attitude is not an easy task, but we can do it.
Are we doing it?
Sorry?
Are we doing it?
Yeah, to a certain extent. Building awareness, right? Building awareness, and also mainly educating women about their capacities, their ability to hold top positions. And also for men to say that, like, for men to understand that women are equally capable, and for them to be humble enough to take that point, yes, when women are equally capable. So we need to have interventions. This is one of such interventions, I believe, right? When we do things little by little, it will happen, but not immediately. It will take some time, but we need to take some steps. If we just say, that is it, what can we do about it? Nothing will happen. We need to start in small steps, so it will make a big impact in the long run.
Professor Hemamali, one more question. You said you were in the university system for 30 long years. Yes. From 30 years ago and today, do you see a difference?
A little difference, I would say, not a very big one, but still the attitudes, I think even women are responsible for that, because women sometimes undervalue their capabilities because of the social construction of gender. Within your socialization, the way you have been brought up, in the patriarchal social structure, women are brought up in a certain way that your attitudes get formed, that we are a subordinated set of people, right? So that subordinated mentality prevents you from going a long way, right? But there's a gradual change. Say when it comes to, I think, the Generation Z, there's a different way of thinking. So we might have a change in the coming future at a faster rate, but during these 30 years, there are changes, but very slow when it comes to the pace of change.
Yeah. I would like to pose my question to Professor Priyanjali. You spoke about women being abused by men verbally and physically. It's evident not only in Sri Lanka, around the world as well. But personally, and I've seen that it's not only men that put down women. There are women also who put down other women to climb the ladder. For example, you've seen beauty pageants in parliament, even in your own house probably. What do you think it's the woman's responsibility to not put down other women in order to climb the ladder?
So Ruhasa, there's a lot of research on this, the women issue. There's evolutionary, there's a lot of theories as to why there's envy amongst women. So worldwide research have shown that women are more envious towards other women than men are towards other men. That's what worldwide research, this is not my own making. However, when we did the first research on envy in Sri Lanka, me and 3 of my colleagues, we didn't see that. We just saw that equal amounts of envy between gender. But whatever it is, there is a reason for these women being more envious of their counterparts and therefore cutting them to size and being competitive. One is what we call the evolutionary reasoning, and that's a long story, maybe I won't go there. But we need to accept that there is a certain amount of envy resulting in competitiveness between women, which I think is one of the biggest issues really. Like as you said, there may be other structural issues in a society, and there may be males who may be preventing the progression of a woman upward mobility. But the women are a massive issue as well. So then how do we overcome this? I would think that all of us as human beings, we are always all evolving. We feel envy and jealousy towards another person. Being aware of that, acknowledging that right now I do feel somewhat envious and compared towards this woman in my life, maybe my sister, my cousin, my co-worker, whoever. And then making a concentrated effort not to act based on that feeling. Act meaning through verbal things or physical actions. And rather, so it's actually, you're actually changing your habit set of your mind. Your usual tendency would be to make a sarcastic remark, talk behind the woman's back, stop that promotion. But now here, when you feel that way, instead you say, you look lovely in that dress. From where did you get that? Rather than making some snide remark. So when we start reprogramming our mind to be in harmonious relationships with women, it becomes more beautiful. And if more people can do that, the society can become beautiful. It takes time and commitment on the part of women too.
Is it because of not having equal opportunities? Sometimes she gets this and the other one doesn't get that, maybe that
Actually, it's apparently this evolutionary theory. What it says is that, Stone Age, we lived for if you think of like written history, it's about 5,000 years, in human beings. So we lived a long time, for centuries, in huts, in caves, where it's individual units, not as even villages. So during that time, this evolutionary psychology theory says is that women needed to be very careful of other women encroaching into their family system. It was kind of programmed into our system. But now it's not the case. We are living in communities. That fear doesn't have to be there, but that programming is there. That's what is being carried over. So it's not necessarily because the other woman has anything. Sometimes women who have a lot of things going for them might still cut a woman who doesn't have much things going for them because of these tendencies. Ruhasa. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to pose a question to Amita. Speaking of the position of Sri Lankan women in terms of economic decision making, where do you think women stand in such situations? Basically, their contribution versus their actual decision making power.
That's a really important question. I do want to pivot slightly back to something that we were talking about earlier in terms of this characterization of women as perhaps more likely to feel envy towards other women. I think for me in particular, I'm a little bit wary of taking that kind of approach. That's because, for example, when we ask the question of a beauty pageant and women competing in a beauty pageant, right? There's one prize, let's assume, or runner-up prize, maybe two. And you have, it's inherently a competitive situation, the beauty pageant. We don't ask the same question of men in a race. We don't ask why are they being so competitive with each other, or men in a boxing match, right? And I think if you ask that question, you would get a different response. Are men more likely to be more competitive than women? I'm sure evolutionary psychology has a perspective on it. But from an economic and political perspective, I think a more productive way of thinking about this question is how do we increase the economic pie for women? How do we increase the positions available for women politically so that women don't have to see the positions available to them as minimal? When you see that there's only one crown or there's only one seat in parliament available to you, you're more likely to be competitive because you are put in a situation where you're competing over finite resources. So I guess to pivot back to what you asked, how do we think of increasing the economic pie available for women, and how do we think of maximizing the political opportunities or the opportunities for women to participate in Sri Lanka's political life, and therefore how do we eliminate this characterization of women always being in competition with each other? And I also I'm making this point explicitly because I've seen I remember a former Women's Affairs Minister saying that women can't be trusted because they're always competing with each other. They're always trying to cut each other down. And I don't think that women necessarily are inherently like this, but there are certain circumstances, structures that mean that there are just fewer crowns available for women, and so they're inherently in a more competitive situation. But to get back to your question on the economy, Sri Lanka is doing pretty badly. Where actually, in terms of female labor force participation, there are a large number of barriers to women's participation in the labor force. And what that means, to give you an example or to contextualize that for you, Sri Lanka's labor force participation gap, we're like 20th in the world, the gender gap. And there are several reasons for this, but it's a huge problem. We could be adding 14% to our GDP by 2025 by just increasing the number of women working in higher productivity jobs, by increasing or decreasing the barriers to female labor force participation. And in an economic crisis, that's not something we can afford to dismiss or ignore, right? It's a huge, women are, and I don't like to think of them entirely as resources because we're not simply, a resource. We're also human beings that are, we deserve equality whether or not we're productive individuals in an economy. But it is, during an economic crisis, something that we have to think about very carefully. So we're not doing well, and there's a lot more we can do.
All right. Professor Hemali, when we speak about the ways in which women are disadvantaged, we need to consider the intersectionality of gender with ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, language. Speak to us about the importance of not considering gender in isolation, but as an intersectional concept.
Yeah. So when it comes to gender, yes, women in a patriarchal social structure are in a subordinated position. But going beyond, as you pointed out, intersectionality come into play. Now, within the Sri Lankan context, if you take women who are working in the garment industry in Sri Lanka, majority of the women are coming from rural areas. And they are not from well-to-do families. They are poor. So being women, being rural, being poor intersects, and inequality get reproduced. So not only gender and being rural or urban, or being poor or rich, but there are other ways of intersectionality coming in. Let's say when it comes to the universities, now at the Faculty of Management Studies, our medium of instructions is English. When we get the first year students, majority of them till the year 13, they study in the Sinhala language, our native language, right?
Or Tamil.
Or Tamil, yeah, or Tamil. So they all come to Sri Javadanapura's Faculty of Management, and from the first year we start teaching in English. So those who had the privilege of learning in English and having the privilege of talking in English at home, right? Those who are fluent in English, they are privileged, because for them, like talking in English, teaching in English, understanding in English, totally fine. But imagine people who are coming from all the remote areas. During the wartime, we had students who came from the border villages. They were studying in bunkers. What about their English knowledge? So this also brings in the intersectionality. So there are different bases that reproduce inequalities, and they intersect. And in a patriarchal social structure, gender and other different bases of inequalities get like into intersections. Even the women in rural areas, boys might travel long distances and learn English, at least a little bit. But for girls, you all know how much of a protection the parents are giving to the girl child, right? Because in the Sri Lankan context, they want the girl child to be protected up to the marriage, to be a virgin at the marriage. So for all that, this protection prevents women from traveling and learning their English. So again, being a woman coming from a rural area, these young women are at a less privilege than their boys, right? Than the boys, the counterparts. So likewise, there are very many bases that comes and intersecting and reproducing inequalities. Hope I answered your
Interestingly, who are we protecting our girl children from? Is a question that needs to be answered.
I would like to pose my question to Professor Hema Mali. One of our viewers have sent us a question. It says, I cannot understand why women cannot initiate and make change for themselves without waiting for it to be given to them by a man. If each woman asserts herself in a confident manner relative to her environment, change will happen. What do you have to say?
Sorry?
Fantastic question.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so to a certain extent I agree, yes, we need to be our own catalysts, I would say, change agents, but as I told you all from the beginning, being in a patriarchal social structure, the way we are being socialized, the socialization process, we all go through a socialization process, right? Within the socialization process, the way a girl is being nurtured is totally different from the way a boy is being nurtured, right? What are the little toys a girl gets? Mostly dolls, right? Kitchen utensils, sewing equipment, right? But for boys, cars, guns, right? So the way we are being brought up, and when it comes to the household arrangements, traditionally it says that it's the men who must get the best food because they are the sole breadwinners, right? So they need more strength to go out, find things and come in. But we forget that women has a very important reproductive role to be played. So they are getting the leftovers after giving the best food to the men at home, right? Women are eating the leftovers. So I can't remember exactly the year, I mean the grade in school. There's a textbook. In that textbook, there's a picture. At the table, the father, the son's friends, they are all seated and having their meals. The mother is serving, right? The daughter is carrying the glasses of water to those who are at the table. So can you see how the subordination is being ingrained into our lives as women? And when it comes to women, when it comes to the playground, there are certain sports that women are not very much interested in playing because the society thinks that these games are for men. If you take wrestling, for example, in Sri Lanka, how many women wrestlers do we have, right? Wrestling is not for women, but if you have watched the very famous Indian film, Dangal, where this father who was a wrestling champion, he couldn't get a gold, right? He couldn't get a gold for India. So he dreams for a gold through his son. So he gets married. This is Amir Khan's film Dangal. Amir Khan plays the major role of Mahavir Singh. So he expects the wife to give a birth to a son. Unfortunately, he gets 4 daughters, right? So he gives up the hope for a gold. But one day, there was a complaint by a neighbor about how his 2 elder girls gave good shots, right, to 2 boys in the same school. So these parents brought the boys, like you must watch the film. They were given properly by these girls, attacked really well. And the father thought that there's the cousin, a young man living with them. The father thought that when the complaint came that this young boy only attacked the 2 boys. But to see the 2 girls have attacked them, they showed how they actually gave the shots. They showed it, they acted it. So at that point, the father realized that the girls are quite capable of becoming wrestlers. So he just forgot, or I would say, he just thrashed away all the social norms of a woman becoming a wrestler, and she trained the 2 girls to become wrestlers. And ultimately, they won gold for India. Right. So I think that answered.
Yeah, thank you for that. To this question, I'd like to get, Amita, your response as well. Let's talk a bit about social structures. The question was, and I think it's really important to sort of delve into it, why are women just sitting around waiting for their rights? Why can't they go and get them? So I'd like your opinion on the social structure inequality aspect. We also see how the law sometimes acts in a regressive manner. If we take the law pertaining to abortion in Sri Lanka, there's no bodily autonomy for the woman. Speak to us about different aspects, in your opinion, to answer the question, how can women not just sit around and wait for their rights to be given to them on a silver platter?
Thanks for posing this question to me also. Yes, I think it's, so the question, if I recall correctly, was why can't women just have high levels of confidence and simply go and get the equality or the rights that they deserve? And the way I would answer that, looking at this question from a political and economic perspective or angle, is because a lot of the time the decision makers are men, and they're not even aware of the kind of the barriers that are affecting women, and maybe they're not interested in elevating women to these positions of power. And when you have, and I mentioned this statistic before, when you have 5.3% of your parliament composed of men, that's not a majority for women. Women constitute 52% of our population, yet we don't have a majority like that in parliament to pass laws that may be progressive towards women. And any amount of confidence displayed by those 5 parliamentarians in the House is not going to lead to a law magically appearing on behalf of women. So I think it's really important to recognize that structurally this patriarchy exists structurally. It exists in politics and it exists in the economy as well. You mentioned board members. There's about, I think, 10% of board members in companies that are listed in the stock exchange are women, or less than that.
Right.
Women are simply not in decision-making powers in companies either. So how are the interests of women workers going to be considered or taken into account when decisions pertaining to them are being made? They're not, or they're not going to be considered. And we can, think of this from a cultural perspective. We can, try to change the attitudes and the norms pertaining to each individual in the country. But we do need to empower women first before we say that now you have confidence, go and get the rights you're entitled to. We do need to empower them politically, and we need to empower them economically as well.
And finally, let's get the opinion of our resident clinical psychologist, Professor Pianjali. Women are meant to be soft and kind and compassionate, and men are meant to be aggressive and well-built and these gym bro types. But I want to speak to you about toxic masculinity, this concept of boys don't cry culture, where boys are not able to express emotions, and women are meant to sort of mother them and be the soft one in the relationship. All of that. And again, I want to connect it with that question where women's confidence, is that going to go against them? So speak to us about that aspect, and also about intergenerational trauma, where if your grandfather beat up your father's going to think that it's okay to beat you up, and then you're going to think that it's okay to beat your child up. So this intergenerational trauma, how to sort of break the cycle of trauma. Speak to us about all of those aspects. Thank you.
Got 3 questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first one is, I think I'll take Ruhasa's, the
Yes.
one that was posed. So as was said, I think in earlier questions also, these matters have to be looked in different ways. So we have got Hema Mali and Amita who gave their perspective on it. So I'll give you the psychological perspective. So taking Hema Mali's lovely example about the textbook.
Yes.
Now, just as boys who look at this would think that the woman should be there taking the tea and the coffee and feeding them and all sorts of things, The girl who reads that also thinks I should be carrying the tea and the coffee. You know? So that's a socialization of the woman.
Right.
So then the woman also thinks like maybe I should be like say the secretary as opposed to running for presidency. So overcoming that strategy, that kind of a, you know, that I have a glass ceiling, is not easy, Sonali, because it's an inherent belief that I can only do this. So only when, then I like to connect that observation with this intergenerational thing. So if you are born into a family where it's understood and accepted that a man is the leader, while the woman has to be the one who is supporting him and but not to be in the forefront, it can translate from generation to generation. So there should be somebody who is called the generational curse breaker. This one person who would think otherwise. So who would that be, and what could that lead to? One is education.
Right.
You know, that's why education is so important. So this one, at one generation, somebody who goes to school, who goes to some colleges, a university, reads, thinks, no, this is all right, you know. Girls also can do it. You can be feminine, but still be a leader. You can be masculine and still be a leader. So therefore, the way you can change these intergenerational issues is, one of the issues is education. And also being exposed to different perspectives, which means you have to live in a society that gives education on different open-minded perspectives too. Then a woman who has been told that her place is secondary, when they have relatives and friends around them that think, no, you can do it, she would break the generational curse. And then a new area has been opened up for the remaining women of that. That's just one stance to look at.
And finally, about the toxic masculinity before going to Mariam.
Yeah. So this notion of feminine, masculine, they can both be leaders. You know, so for example, a feminine, a healthy feminine woman would be who's more receptive, who listens, who considers people's perspective. Now, they're all fantastic qualities of a leader. While a masculine, the healthy masculine, is somebody who is structured, who can look at things and give solutions. He also could be a leader. But when those healthy feminine, healthy masculine goes out of whack, when they become domineering in the case of a man or very needy in the case of a woman, we call it toxic. So in order to not be toxic, again, that individual has to be very broad-minded to know when he is becoming toxic. While some societies may actually venerate toxic masculine, isn't it? Particularly traditional societies. They like this toxic type, so shouting and screaming and giving their viewpoints, and that is a man. But is it actually a man, is the question.
Sonali, can I add a bit to her question, why we are not taking our own initiatives, right? There's a book written by Judith Wackman called Managing Like a Man. So, you know, when it comes to an organization, managing an organization is not easy, right? So there are very capable women who are running organizations. But as you said, society expects a woman to be very, I would say, very soft, right? Not always talking in a very high tone, right? So these, I think the characteristics assigned by the society, woman has to be like this, man has to be like this. But in certain situations, when you take leadership, according to Wackman, you need to sometimes come up with your masculine characteristics. We do have our masculine characteristics. So there, when you try to manage like a man, Wackman says you're being treated or you're being named as a witch or a bitch, right? So if you have the capacity to bear that and go ahead, you can take the leadership. Not that you can't, but you must be quite capable of absorbing the pressure that is coming onto you when you try to go against the norm and do whatever the thing that you think is correct. So if you have that capacity, yes, what we are doing here is also something similar to that, I would say.
I'd like to pose a question to Professor Pianjali. Two questions actually, one for Amita, but I'll come to that after this. Talking about sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and topics similar to that. In most parts of our country, people are still to adopt a culture where they have to, get used to calling out sexual harassment and incidents like that. Why? Because incidents like this end up playing a major role in the actions and reactions of women when they come into the society. What can be done to change things like this?
Where the woman is re-victimized.
Yeah.
Is that the question, Mariam? So I think, like I remember I was in a particular situation where a boss had tried to fondle one of the ladies in the department. And the first question that the HR asked was, what was she wearing? How short was her skirt? Now that's a very irrelevant question, So it's again those and the person who asked these questions was also a female HR manager. You see, so it's all these ideas that it is a woman's fault. You called upon it on herself because of what you were wearing, because the man can't manage his impulses, kind of a thing. But as Hemali was saying, now having even discussions like this, we are educating the public that it doesn't have to be like this. So secondly, when an organization, in this case the context that I gave you was happening in an organization, but even in a family, it works well for the men to also put the blame on the woman.
But there's another side to it, right? Because now you're talking about how the woman has ended up complaining or whatever. No?
Yeah.
But there is a side where people, like women, believe that they shouldn't bring it out and they don't have to tell people because it's their fault. Somehow in their head, they think it's their fault and they don't call out incidents like that. How do these affect them in the future?
One of the reasons that they may not say is, yes, so it would have been ingrained that you usually call upon these aggressions on yourself because of some lack in you. Whatever it is, sexual harassment, even though the women might believe, I called upon because of what I was wearing, for instance, that would be a very superficial belief she has. Because deep inside, sexual violation is a violation of one's own body, which is very precious. So it can have a huge impact on the woman, particularly if the woman is a girl child, which is child sexual abuse, which has huge repercussions for that person's adult sexual relationships and intimate relationships. But yes, so many women, because of other repercussions that they have to face, would keep things, even date rape and marital rape, to themselves because they are afraid of what will happen if they talk about it.
Right.
Excuse me, Maria.
Yeah.
Professor Pianjali, can you tell us the man's role in safeguarding the woman's psychological, personal safety? We always spoke about women.
Yeah.
What should the man do to save the woman?
Yes, I think if a man who genuinely cares either for his woman who is in partnership, or if it's a father or an uncle or whoever, who's actually a man, a human being who is genuinely wholesome in his mind, who's actually having good psychological health, would care for the other person. It goes on the woman's side also. Yeah. So those individuals who actually violate a woman either sexually or psychologically are people who are toxic, the same thing that Sonali said, toxic masculinity. So a man who is genuinely empathic and has a very well-developed thing doesn't have to do anything, it comes from within to look after the well-being of his partner or the child or the daughter. Now, if there is somebody here who's looking at this and thinks, well, I've been toxic a little bit, let me change, because there are people can change. So what could you do? Is a question, right? What can we do? So if you're such a person, think about whom you're violating against. Maybe it's your partner, your girlfriend. Would you like it if that happens to your daughter? Because usually we have a connection with our child, right? Would you like it if your daughter is in the hands of a man like you, what you're doing now? So take a perspective shift. Shift your perspective. That might help a toxic masculine man to become a more wholesome one. But you have to have the need. You can't force it on somebody. Is that okay?
Yeah. I'd like to pose a question to Amita. during the past few months, I would say, domestic aids going abroad overseas and being abused has made headlines. And in our country especially, it's been a trend for as long as I've known for low-income families to send their daughters and females in the family to go abroad and work as domestic aids. And when they're being sexually abused or harassed and being things of that sort, why has our country, even in the past, encouraged them to still go abroad? What is the reason? Because I know, for one, the reason is that they generate dollars into the country. But there can be other ways of doing it instead of, going abroad as domestic aids, because this could be harmful for them as well, right? Do you want to touch on that?
Sure. I think also there are statistics that show that the number of women migrating overseas for labor has actually been declining. So even though we've seen women going overseas perhaps our entire lives to earn higher incomes, that's no longer the case. I think recently more men, the number of men migrating overseas has surpassed the number of women. But that being said, I think the question you're asking is very important. Women are being sent, or women are choosing to go overseas. Yeah. I think partly why they do that is in some cases to get away from maybe harmful domestic situations. And so the question is, how do we reduce instances of domestic violence and make Sri Lanka safer for women and address the violence that women face in Sri Lanka. From another perspective, it's just very important for Sri Lanka to have good jobs for women here. And that will ensure that women feel like they don't have to leave their children behind or their families behind and go and migrate overseas to get the incomes that they have a right, that they want or that they need. If they have good jobs in Sri Lanka, there's less of a need for them to go overseas. I think tackling this question of how do we reduce abuse when women go overseas for work is a multifaceted one, right? We need to make sure that women who are working overseas have access to embassies and safe shelters and so on that are functional and that they can trust. We need to make sure that the women going overseas also have higher negotiating power with their employers. I think if you look at the way the Philippines, for example, upskilled and trained their migrant workers, you see that country actually was very intentional and deliberate about it. They trained their overseas migrant workers in child caregiving, in nursing, and so those women, when they went to employers, were actually highly valued and had a higher negotiating power with them vis-a-vis their employer. They were able to have their choice of employers. They weren't as vulnerable. I guess that goes back to how do we in Sri Lanka think about what we are doing to make sure migrant workers aren't as vulnerable, and importantly, do migrant workers, women who are going overseas to work, do they have the ability to vote? Because if not, if they can't vote from overseas, what incentive do politicians have in Sri Lanka to take their interests seriously if they're not even part of the voter base, in a sense? We need to empower these women, within our political system as well.
You were giving examples of other countries. Is it that females from low-income families in Sri Lanka have their career options so limited that they choose to go as domestic aids? Because we don't see men going to work as domestic aids as much, right? So what can we do to change the trend? Is it a shortcoming when it comes to education or whatsoever from our country, or what is it?
This goes back to this question about why there are so few women in Sri Lanka's labor force, right? Yeah. No, the answer is no, that it's not necessarily related to education or broadly. Actually, if you look at education statistics, you'll see that women graduate at higher rates from universities than men do. So there shouldn't be, in a sense, there's nothing wrong with the in a broad level, there's nothing wrong with the skills that women have or the educational qualifications that women have. Of course, within education, there are certain constraints on women, in the sense that women often, there's a phenomenon called educational and occupational streaming, which happens in Sri Lanka. For example, about, I think, 80% of arts graduates are women, but arts graduates are less likely to be employed than other graduates. And we do have less women than men partaking in STEM subjects. And so when women graduate, they're not able to find jobs in industries like engineering or IT, right? And there are many male-dominated industries that are not employing women for that reason, but also because these industries, being male-dominated, discourage the entry of women into those industries as well. So that's the occupational segregation part of that. So, there are many reasons Sri Lanka's labor force participation rates are low. One of them is educational and occupational segregation. You also have the fact that women face harassment in the workplace. They face harassment on public transport getting to work. This obviously then discourages women from working. And of course, as we talked about earlier, we talked about these cultural norms that can be very constraining for women. They're expected to stay at home. Motherhood is one of the factors that is, having a child under the age of 5 is one of the factors that is most closely associated with women dropping out of the labor force. And when you delve into that, you'll find that Sri Lanka as a country, we don't provide childcare services that are sufficient for women. And so even if they do want to continue working, there's this dual burden that they have to take care of the family, they have to take care of their children, and they don't have any state support. They don't have adequate maternity leave benefits to enable them to partake in the workforce. So it's not about their skills. I feel it's a large part of this problem is what the state is not doing to support women.
Okay, I'd like to touch on one more thing. I saw this report recently, I believe it was by Bloomberg, that the global economy could lose out on at least $7 trillion due to gender parity. What is the situation like in Sri Lanka when it comes to this?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we could add 14% to our GDP by 2025 just by increasing the number of women increasing.
But does the pay gap exist?
The gender pay gap?
Yeah.
Yeah. Separately from labor force participation, women earn about 63% of the wages that men earn in Sri Lanka. So yes, it does exist. And it's again one of the factors that prevent women from wanting to go out and work, the discrimination they face.
And while our country is going through an economic crisis like this, don't you think that counts for something, that we're losing out on something like that just because of, pay gaps and, gender parity in the workforce and all of that stuff?
Absolutely. I mean, this is why I fundamentally don't believe that these issues that are affecting women, that of course affect women, are simply a women's issue. They're a national issue. Gender inequality is something that impacts men, women, and children. It affects the welfare of our entire country. So this is something that absolutely is important during an economic crisis and outside of an economic crisis also.
I'd like to touch on one more thing, if you all don't mind. The situation in countries like Afghanistan, the Taliban issue where female children are not allowed to get education, or the issue in Iran about the whole headscarf situation. When things like that happen, we tend to go to the international community for help. And I know we have the UN and stuff like that, but do you think we have enough international institutions that actually focus on issues like this and work towards helping these women? Because the issue in Afghanistan has been going on for quite a long time. And you were talking about how we have cultural issues and all of that at workplaces too. So is there enough support that the women get so that they can actually step down and work for what they want to work for?
Well, I see a lot of constructive work by international organizations in Sri Lanka in highlighting some of the grievances faced by women. And I know that the Sri Lankan government too has signed or ratified several conventions, that should hold them to certain standards in terms of the way they treat the state protects and empowers women. However, at the end of the day, this is a national issue, and our legislation is passed through a legislature, and this needs to be a national discussion, right? If we're talking about changing cultural norms, international discourse and conventions that international tools can help to an extent. But at the end of the day, we need to contextualize all of this. We need to have these discussions in country. We all already talked about the intersectionality the intersectionality issue, right? That women of minority status or different class groups will experience gender inequality in a different way, and that's why it's so important not to have broad level international guidelines, but to be able to really understand what's happening at a local and community level, and have that inform our obligations to women.
My final question to Professor Piyanjali and Professor Hema Mali. Speak to us about what kind of affirmative action women must take to assert their rights, because they need to sort of double up to ensure that their rights are not being violated, but also that they have enough seats at the table. And if they don't have the seats, they bring their own, or they get on top of the table, whatever it may be. And Professor Piyanjali, if you could speak vis-a-vis slut shaming, this concept of respectability, how to be a good girl in that context. Yes.
Okay. So two things about the second question about the stereotypes of who a good girl is, isn't it? So stereotype is where we box people as to who we think they should be. So different traditions, different countries, different cultures will have different stereotypes of a good girl. So Sri Lanka might have theirs. So from what we know, of course, even in Sri Lanka, depending on the social class and the culture, region of the country, it's different. But usually if somebody, I remember when I first worked at a particular organization about 25 years ago, just the fact that I wore red color lipstick was a difficult point for many people there. There was it was very difficult for them, and they said, when you wear red lipstick, your mental patients whom you treat will get very activated. So I was like, okay, that's a new one, So that's it, isn't it? So I can't wear lipstick, I can't wear jewelry because people will get activated because of me. So I have to not do those things. So that's what you're talking about. So the question is, it is actually us who have made those. So what did I do when I was exposed to that? I said, well, if a person who's come into treatment for me who has depression and they get activated because of my red lipstick, that's really great, because we want them to get activated because they're unhappy. So that's a good thing. So therefore, what I would like to tell a woman is that if somebody makes these remarks to you because of the way you dress and because of the way you talk, you can reply back. You don't have to believe those things, Sometimes we believe those things and we change in order to please people. So if you think that your path is very wholesome and that what they're saying doesn't resonate with what you believe in, stand up for yourself and say so. Because I think that also raises the first question you asked me, which is, if people do try to put you down, yes, we need to have social structures, the political structures, the economic structures, but they take a long time to happen as well. We can take individual responsibility too in order to make something of our life. And for that, you might ruffle certain feathers around people. Because without ruffling them, you might find yourself in the same status quo. So what would you like to be? The same status quo, or ruffle a few feathers, challenge your system, and might possibly make a difference for yourself? It's not easy, but it could be done. Yeah.
And I think that it's also rooted in dignity, self-assuredness, educating yourself on your rights. Thank you very much. Professor Hemamali, in about 1 minute, if you could respond to that question.
So as Pianjali very correctly pointed out, you must have the ability to do the correct thing, which you believe correct, right? Irrespective of the fact that the society is not accepting the same, right? As you said, wearing red lipstick, right? So there we need to understand that we as women, there are certain social barriers, the stereotypes. If you take, for example, the gendered attire, if you are a teacher, you have to wear a sari, right? So what is the relationship between the sari and the quality of teaching, right? But, you know, because the society expects to do so, you are doing without questioning. But if you have the courage to go behind, question, and to do it in a different way, but still validate that you are doing the correct thing, then I think we are able to go an extra mile. And also, as you said, we need to take initiatives. Now, when it comes to University of Sri Lankanapura, when I came after my PhD from the UK, I was appointed as the director for the Center for Gender Equity and Equality at the University of Sri Lankanapura. But at that time, it's just a virtual organization. There was no physical established place as the gender center. So I took a lot of effort to establish a center and also to develop an equality policy for the university. So now people come, when they have issues, they come and talk to us, right? They make complaints. So we go ahead with inquiries. So this is, in a very small way, I established it. I'm no more there, but now there's a different director. But it is going on. So this is a very small step where I started doing things in a different way, but still it matters, it counts, and it is the start of a long change process, I would say. So as Pianjali very correctly pointed out, we need to do things in a different way, assuring that we are doing the correct thing, and it is for the betterment of you as well as the others. So if you can do that, I think we can do a change, and we can see that we are getting our seats at the table.
Oh, absolutely. And also I feel like even if it's a very tiny dent that you can make, I think it's incumbent upon individuals to take individual action instead of waiting on governments, waiting on international organizations. To sort of act, and institutions. I think it's incumbent on each individual, men, women and men, to act. My final question before going for the closing remarks, Amita, I'd like to discuss with you very briefly in about 2 minutes, transitional justice, peace building efforts, lack thereof in Sri Lanka, and how it has disproportionately impacted negatively women of the North and East, Tamil and Muslim mothers of the disappeared, as opposed to Sinhalese mothers of the disappeared. Again, the intersectionality between gender, race, gender, religion, language. Speak to us about the discrimination that occurs in this respect due to a lack of transitional justice mechanisms that are cogent, that are that are meaningful in Sri Lanka.
Well, that's a very large question.
It is
to ask. So the absence of transitional justice mechanisms in the country often, I mean, they're going to have far-reaching consequences for the state of the country beyond women. I think. In our particular case, we find Tamil women from the North and East taking on the role of advocating for their disappeared family members, because, interestingly, I think, or ironically, if Tamil men or Muslim men were to take on that burden or that role, they would face a lot more, they would be seen as a lot more threatening to the state. Because male bodies in that post-war context have been perceived and constructed by the state in very particular ways.
Yeah.
So women are taking on this role. And of course, in these areas, the lack of justice, the lack of truth, the lack of meaningful reparations is incredibly consequential to the lived experiences of individuals in the Northeast.
Yeah.
It depletes trust in the state. It depletes any desire for reconciliation. And it guarantees ethnic conflict is always going to be, just on the surface. It can be triggered at any point because the country has not accounted for some of the things that has happened, some of the grave crimes that were committed during that period. I believe that all of this is related, and if you look at our criminal justice systems, we see that even women in the South, they don't, there's a cross-cutting, cross-national issue of a lack of accountability and impunity for crimes. In 2020, we had 300 cases of rape of adult women, I think 1,600 odd cases of statutory rape, and there were 0 convictions. That's it's something that the criminal justice system in this country is broken, in the South and in the Northeast as well.
Sonali, can I add one more point? As we discussed, we can do something to change the situation. So as the Center for Gender Equity and Equality of the UGC, we introduce a course titled Learning to Live with Diversity for the state universities in Sri Lanka, not for the students only, but for the academic staff, non-academic staff and students, because our university communities are highly diverse, not only gender, ethnicity-wise, religion-wise, sexual orientation-wise. So for the community to understand how diverse we are, and not to look at diversity as a challenge, but to consider it as a strength. So this is a course of 15-hour duration, 15 lessons of 1 hour duration, and we adopted the learner-centered pedagogy. It's an activity-based learning, right? So with that, we are trying to build awareness among the university community about the different diversities that are present, how to understand and appreciate diversity, and how to practice inclusion.
All right.
This is now rolling on in the Sri Lankan state universities.
Okay, thank you very much. For the closing remarks, in 1.5 minutes, I'd like to pose the question to Amita. What is the state's responsibility in enabling and ensuring gender equity in Sri Lanka?
Again, that's a large question, but let me talk about female labor force participation and briefly touch on some of the things that the state can do to ensure that women have greater access to the labor force. We can expand maternity leave benefits from 12 weeks to 14 weeks, expand who receives maternity leave. We can improve our child caregiving services, improve training of child caregivers, and those two alone are pretty large. They will affect, they will enable women to participate in the labor force even after motherhood. We can improve our public transport. This has other positive consequences beyond improving women's access to the labor force, but transport and the lack of mobility is a huge constraint on women's ability to get to work and to want to work. Mm-hmm. The state can also do things to address education and occupational segregation. We can have soft quotas, for example, on boards, and reward corporations with certain affirmative actions as well. the state can, the state has already, I think recently talked about internship programs, but it can encourage women to participate in internships in industries in STEM, which will enable them to partake in male-dominated industries and hopefully one day reach a critical mass and change that culture. Because the future of work in Sri Lanka and across the globe is changing. Lots of jobs that were traditionally taken up by women are being displaced by occupations, professions like tourism or IT that women do need to increasingly take part in. So the state can do a lot of things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In his Women's Day message, the President said that an act on gender equality and women's empowerment has been planned out. A National Women's Commission is to be established. I mean, we can wait and see as to the content of these statutes, the draft bills. I'd like to come to Professor Hemamali Gunathilaka for your closing remarks in 1.5 minutes on the state responsibility to ensure and enable gender equity in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the state, not only having a ministry or a minister responsible of taking care of these matters, it has to be like I would say they need to address it from the grassroots level. I only see things happening at a surface level. But first of all, we need to understand the state of women who are living right around the country, right? It may be urban, it may be rural. So what are the different factors affecting or hindering the development of women in the rural areas, and how it is happening in the urban areas? Look at the level of education of women right across the country. So at different educational levels, what sort of occupations are there? As you correctly pointed out, are there enough opportunities for women to get occupied? So are they treated equally, right? If there are huge gender wage gaps, then it is not the best way to do it. So likewise, they need to look into ensuring that in whatever the occupations women are into, there are enough, I would say, facilities, because we talk about diversity, a woman becomes pregnant, so her needs become different. So are the organizations assuring the facilities for women to come and work in a proper atmosphere, right? So likewise, it's really broad, and they have a massive role to play in ensuring that gender equality is being established in Sri Lanka.
Fantastic. Final question to Professor Pianjali de Souza, Senior Professor, Clinical Psychologist. What is the state's responsibility in educating people and creating structures and systems to enable mental well-being, mental health services for the women and men of Sri Lanka?
I think there is a certain amount of work done on that already by the state because of the services we offer. But may I touch upon the importance of that? Of course. Because we do know that a lot of emphasis is on the body, keeping the body healthy, and that's important. But we know with aging and, with sickness, the body will ultimately deteriorate and go. But the mind, if it is kept in good order, even if the body is deteriorating, you can live a good life. So, and number two is that good mental health will obviously lead to better fulfillment, better life satisfaction, and increased productivity. So more importance on that, more expenditure on that will obviously increase the well-being of the entire society. But I must say that there is a lot of work done in improving the services in the country, but of course much more could be done too, Sonali. Yeah.
All right. Okay, fantastic. We've come to the end of our show. Thank you very much to our fantastic guests, Professor Piyanjali de Souza, Professor Hemamali Gunathilaka, and independent policy analyst Amita Arupragas. Thank you very much for being on the show. I'd also like to thank my colleagues for joining us on this show, Mariam Gunavijaya and Ruhaza Irfan. Thank you so much. I think we had a comprehensive discourse on International Women's Day 2023, the importance of going beyond the tokenism, how must meaningful action be taken to ensure and enable gender equity in Sri Lanka, how do we work on our mental health as women, how do we also gain the support of society, the state, the responsibility of the state in ensuring these structures are put in place to get rid of the structural inequalities that exist, and how must men be allies of women. Such an important conversation. Thank you so much for watching us till 11 in the night. We'll see you again next week with another edition of Face the Nation. Thank you for watching. Good night.
Across all walks of life, listening to the people, visiting door to door, witnessing the truth firsthand. This is the heart of the village. Gammata, for the people, by the people.
What makes a reform package and a reform agenda successful is sticking to it. So it's not just about the policy and doing the policy, but it's also very much about how that is communicated to people.
Imagine the situation where you have a girl child who is menstruating but has no access to a toilet. What do they do?
Let's talk a bit about how the education system and the school curriculum needs to be constantly updated to incorporate all of this, and also the role of university students.
It's about equality and equity, so allowing everyone to have the opportunity to access what they need despite their disability, and then also having the same equal rights as a person without a disability.
The People's Platform, every Monday and Friday at 7:30 p.m. on TV1.
At least 40% of women coming into parliament. There has to be that equal number come as professionals.
I think election expenditure campaign finance is necessary because there are huge sums of money that are spent.
Keep the pressure on the government and on the parliament and the decision makers that enough is enough.
Very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Newsline Live. We're broadcasting, as we almost always do, from the Newsfirst studios in Dorset Street.
Newsline, Monday to Friday at 8:30 p.m. on TV1.
Gammata, for the people, by the people.
සුසුම්වලට හීන පවන තරුවල දයති හැඟුම් දහස් කතා කියයි නුඹ ගැනම නිති රහස් එක්ක හිත හුලන ඇස්වලට ඇබී